Darius Mitchell, a black single dad in his 30s, sat alone at a corner table in a small cafe on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, wondering why he had let a 7-year-old talk him into this. The woman across from him hadn't looked up once since he arrived. Her shoulders trembled beneath an elegant coat, and when she finally lifted her face, mascara traced faint rivers down her cheeks. She wasn't embarrassed. She was broken. Darius reached for his jacket, ready to spare them both the awkwardness, but then her eyes found his, and something in them begged him to stay. He settled back into his chair slowly. The cafe was nearly empty, just a teenager behind the counter and an elderly man by the window. It wasn't the kind of place Darius would have chosen for a first date, but quiet was all he could afford. The woman wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She wore a silk blouse that probably cost more than his monthly rent, and her blonde hair was pulled back carefully. She looked like she belonged in a different zip code, a different life entirely. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't how I wanted tonight to go." Darius shrugged, reaching for the laminated menu he had already memorized. "Wasn't expecting anything particular myself." She let out a small laugh, more breath than sound. "That's refreshingly honest." "Don't have much energy for pretending," he admitted. "I work the night shift at a maintenance facility. By the time I get home, my daughter's already getting ready for school. We get maybe an hour together before she's on the bus, and I'm trying to sleep. Most days, I'm running on coffee and whatever willpower I've got left." The woman tilted her head slightly, studying him. "How old is your daughter?" 7. Her name's Amara. Just saying her name softened something in his chest. She's the one who signed me up for this app. Actually found my old phone in a drawer, figured out my password, made me a profile, used a photo of me from 3 years ago when I still had some muscle definition. For the first time since he'd arrived, the woman smiled. It was small and fragile, but it was real. "She sounds resourceful." "That's one word for it." Darius grinned. "She told me I needed to get back out there. Said Mrs. Patterson told her that men who are alone too long start talking to their plants." The woman's smile widened slightly. "What about you?" Darius asked. "What brings you to a place like this?" The smile faded. She looked down at her untouched glass of water, tracing the rim with one manicured finger. "I'm just tired," she said quietly. He recognized that kind of tired. It wasn't the exhaustion that came from too little sleep or too much work. It was the kind that settled into your bones when life had been asking too much for too long. He'd felt it after his wife left, after the hospital bills piled up, after he realized that the American dream had somehow forgotten his address. "I'm Darius, by the way," he offered, realizing that they hadn't actually introduced themselves. "Claire," she said, and something flickered across her face, almost like hesitation. "Just Claire." Before he could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw Amara's face grinning up at him from the screen. The photo taken last summer when they'd gone to the county fair. His little girl with warm brown skin and a smile that made him forget the world for a second. He answered without thinking. "Hey, sweetheart, everything okay? Did you eat dinner yet?" Amara's voice was serious, almost maternal in its concern. "You always forget to eat when you're nervous." Darius felt his ears warm. "I'm fine, Amara. Mrs. Patterson is right there with you." "Yeah, she's watching her shows. I'm supposed to be asleep, but I wanted to make sure you were being good at your date." "Are you being nice? Did you remember to smile?" "I'm being good," he promised, very aware that Claire was watching him. "Now, get to bed. I'll see you in the morning." "Tell the lady I said hi," Amara instructed before hanging up. Darius tucked the phone away, an apologetic look on his face. But when he glanced at Claire, her expression had changed completely. Her eyes glistened with fresh tears, though these seemed different somehow, sadder and more distant. "She sounds wonderful," Claire said softly. "You're lucky." "I know," he paused, then added, "Most days she's the only reason I get up. Not because I have to take care of her, but because she makes me want to be worth something. She looks at me like I'm some kind of superhero. And I keep thinking one day she'll figure out I'm just a guy who fixes machines for a living." Claire nodded slowly, as if his words had touched something buried deep inside her. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like two people standing at the edge of the same cliff, looking down at the same darkness below. The conversation wandered into safer territory for a while, but every time Darius tried to ask about her work, Claire deflected smoothly, almost professionally. "You must do something that involves a lot of talking," Darius observed after her third graceful redirect. "Sales, maybe public relations." Claire's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Something like that. I'm not trying to pry, just curious." He leaned back, studying her. "You've got this look about you like you're always thinking 3 moves ahead." "Is that a compliment or a criticism?" "Neither, just an observation." He took a sip of his lukewarm coffee. "My supervisor at the facility has the same look, always calculating. Drives me crazy because I never know what he's actually thinking." Claire's hand curled into a loose fist. "What kind of facility?" "Industrial maintenance, 3rd shift mostly. Keeping the machines running so the day shift workers can do their jobs." He shrugged. "Not glamorous, but it pays the bills. Most of them anyway. The ones that don't get paid go to the bottom of the pile." "Do they treat you well there?" The people in charge. Something in her tone made him pause. It wasn't idle curiosity. There was weight behind the question. "They treat me like what I am," he said carefully. "A pair of hands, a tool to be used when needed and stored when not. The managers walk past like I'm part of the machinery. Had one guy, a junior executive, tell me once that people like me were the reason the company had to cut costs. That we were the problem. Said it right to my face." Claire's face went pale. She stared at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Something between shame and recognition. "That's not true," she said, her voice low and fierce. "The people who keep things running are never the problem. They're the solution that everyone else takes for granted." Easy for you to say. Darius hadn't meant it to sound bitter, but the words came out sharp anyway. "No offense, but from the looks of things, you've never had to worry about whether the lights will stay on next month." She didn't argue with him. Instead, she looked down at the table, her shoulders hunching slightly. You're right," she admitted. "I haven't, but that doesn't mean I don't see it. I see more than you might think." The conversation could have ended there, but instead, Claire reached across the table and touched his hand just briefly, his dark brown fingers tightening for a second around the warmth of her touch. Just enough to stop time for a single heartbeat. "Can we walk somewhere?" she asked. "I'm not ready to go home yet." Darius looked at her for a long moment. This mysterious woman who wouldn't tell him what she did for a living, who cried in cafes and spoke like someone carrying the weight of the world. Every sensible instinct told him to say goodnight and walk away. "Sure," he heard himself say. "I know a spot." They walked along the Scioto River, the city lights reflecting off the water in broken patterns of gold and white. The November air carried a bite that made Claire pull her coat tighter, but she didn't complain. She matched Darius's pace, step for step. "Amara tried to make me breakfast last week," Darius said, breaking a comfortable silence. "She wanted to surprise me when I got home from my shift. Got up at 6 o'clock in the morning, dragged a chair over to the stove, and tried to make scrambled eggs." Claire glanced at him, a hint of a smile playing at the corner of her lips. "How did that go?" The smoke alarm woke up the entire building. Mrs. Patterson from next door came over in her bathrobe with a fire extinguisher. Amara was standing in the middle of the kitchen with egg in her hair and tears running down her face, crying because she ruined my surprise. Claire laughed, a real laugh this time, warm and unguarded. The sound seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised him. "What did you do?" "I scraped the burned parts off the pan, ate what was left, and told her it was the best breakfast I'd ever had." He smiled at the memory. "She made me Pinky promise to teach her how to cook properly. So now on my days off, we make pancakes together. She's gotten pretty good at flipping them. Only drops about half of them on the floor now." They stopped at a bench overlooking the river. Claire sat down first, her movements suddenly heavy with exhaustion. She looked out at the water, and her expression shifted into something darker. "You're a good father," she said quietly. "Better than you probably realize." I'm just doing what I can with what I have. That's exactly what makes you good. She pulled her coat tighter. The people who do whatever it takes, who sacrifice their own comfort for someone they love, those are the people who actually matter, not the ones with the big offices and the impressive titles. He sat down beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. Sounds like you're speaking from experience. Claire was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I have a decision to make, she said soon, and no matter what I choose, people are going to get hurt. Families are going to suffer. Lives are going to change in ways I can't undo. What kind of decision? She shook her head slowly. I can't tell you. I wish I could, but I can't. Darius didn't push. You know what Amara says when she doesn't know what to do? She says, Daddy, let's think about what a good person would do. She got it from some cartoon, but it's not bad advice. Claire turned to look at him, and in the dim light her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. What if being a good person means destroying yourself? Then maybe the definition of good needs to change. He held her gaze. You can't save anyone if you don't survive. They sat there in silence, two people from different worlds sharing the same bench, the same night, the same uncertain sense that something significant was happening between them. The river flowed past without caring about their troubles. When Claire finally spoke again, her voice was stronger. Thank you for walking with me. Thank you for asking. She stood up, smoothing her coat with hands that trembled slightly. The evening had shifted into something neither of them had expected. I should go, she said, but she didn't move. Darius stood as well, suddenly very aware of how close they were standing. He could smell her perfume. Something expensive and subtle that seemed at odds with the raw vulnerability she'd shown him tonight. Darius, his name on her lips sounded different somehow, weighted with meaning he couldn't quite grasp. I need to tell you something before we say goodbye. His heart shifted in his chest. Okay? She stepped closer, so close that he could see the individual tears clinging to her lashes. Her hand came up to rest against his chest, just above his heart, and she leaned in until her lips nearly brushed his ear. What she whispered took only a few seconds to say, but those words hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and turning his blood to ice. Claire pulled back and looked at him one last time. Her expression was unreadable, a mask slipping back into place over the woman he'd glimpsed throughout the evening. Then she turned and walked away, her heels echoing against the pavement. She didn't look back, not once. And Darius stood there in the cold November night, her whispered words echoing in his mind, trying to understand how a single sentence could change everything he thought he knew about his life. The next 3 days passed in a haze of exhaustion and confusion. Darius went through the motions of his routine, waking Amara for school, sleeping through the afternoon, heading to his shift at the industrial complex that housed Kensington Industries' Ohio manufacturing hub. But something had shifted inside him, a constant awareness that the ground beneath his feet wasn't as solid as he'd believed. On the fourth night, his supervisor called a mandatory meeting. All maintenance staff, first shift through third, crowded into the break room with its flickering lights and coffee-stained tables. Rumors had been circulating for weeks about restructuring, layoffs, the usual corporate buzzwords that meant nothing to the people actually doing the work. Then the door opened and Darius's world tilted on its axis. She walked in wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than his annual clothing budget, her hair pulled back in that same careful style. Her face sat in an expression of cold professionalism. Behind her came a cluster of executives in similar attire, tablets in hand already calculating the worth of human lives in terms of quarterly projections. Clare Kensington, CEO of Kensington Industries. The woman who had cried in a cafe and whispered secrets in his ear stood before him now as if they had never met. She addressed the room without looking at him. Her voice was clipped, efficient, completely unlike the soft tones she'd used on their walk by the river. She spoke about market conditions and competitive pressures, about the difficult decisions that leadership sometimes had to make for the good of the company. Darius watched her from the back of the room, his hands clenching at his sides. She had told him she was tired. She had asked him about being treated well. She had talked about good people and survival, and now she stood before him wearing a mask so perfect that he almost doubted his own memories. The meeting ended with no concrete announcements, just vague assurances that further information would be forthcoming. The maintenance workers filed out in small groups, muttering to each other about resumes and unemployment benefits. Darius stayed behind. Claire was speaking with one of her executives, her tablet glowing with charts and figures. She glanced up as the room emptied, and for a fraction of a second, her eyes met his. He saw recognition there and something else, something that looked almost like fear. But then the mask slipped back into place, and she returned her attention to the executive as if Darius were just another piece of furniture. He understood then what she had whispered to him that night. "I'm the one who's going to destroy your life." At the time, standing by the river, the words had seemed impossible, almost melodramatic. Now they made perfect, terrible sense. She wasn't warning him about some abstract danger. She was confessing to a sin she hadn't yet committed. She had sat across from him in that cafe, knowing exactly who he was, knowing that her company paid his wages and held his future in its corporate hands, and she had let him talk about Amara and breakfast disasters because she wanted to understand just once what it felt like to be on the other side of her decisions. Darius turned and walked out of the break room without another word. His shift stretched before him like a sentence to be served. 8 hours of keeping the machines running for a company whose CEO had kissed him with a whispered warning on her lips. The following week brought rumors that crystallized into facts. Kensington Industries was restructuring its Ohio operations. 240 jobs would be eliminated over the next quarter. Maintenance staff, the people who kept the whole operation running, would be hit hardest. Severance packages were mentioned, but everyone knew what that really meant. A few weeks' pay and a swift kick out the door. Darius sat at his kitchen table after Amara had gone to school, staring at the notice that had appeared in his employee portal. His position was under review. He had until the end of the month to apply for one of the reduced number of remaining slots, knowing full well that seniority meant nothing when the real decisions were being made in boardrooms 2,000 miles away. He should have been angry. He was angry somewhere beneath the numbness, but mostly he felt tired. That same bone-deep exhaustion he'd seen in Claire's eyes that first night. He finally understood what she'd meant when she said she was tired. On Saturday afternoon, his day off, Darius made a decision. He found the address for Kensington Industries' regional headquarters, left Amara with Mrs. Patterson, and drove 45 minutes to a glass tower that scraped the gray November sky. Getting past security was easier than he'd expected. He simply told them he was there for a meeting regarding the restructuring, and something in his steady gaze convinced them to let him through. The elevator carried him up 23 floors, while soft music played overhead, the kind of generic corporate soundtrack designed to make people feel calm about having their lives dismantled. Claire's office occupied a corner of the top floor, protected by a secretary who looked at Darius's work boots and faded jacket with undisguised skepticism. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but she'll see me." "Sir, Miss Kensington is extremely busy. If you'd like to leave your information..." The office door opened and Claire appeared. She was on the phone, her voice sharp with authority as she discussed something about quarterly projections. When she saw Darius, she stopped mid-sentence. "I'll call you back," she said into the phone, then hung up without waiting for a response. They stood there for a moment, the secretary watching with growing confusion, the distance between them filled with everything they hadn't said since that night by the river. "It's fine, Monica," Claire said finally. "Please hold my calls." She stepped aside and Darius walked into her office. The room was enormous, all glass and chrome and carefully chosen artwork that probably cost more than his house. Darius felt it in his chest, how a black man like him was supposed to move quietly in places like this, supposed to be grateful just to be allowed upstairs. Claire closed the door behind them and leaned against it, her professional mask firmly in place. "I didn't expect to see you here. Didn't expect to find out the woman I went on a date with was planning to fire me." He kept his voice level, almost conversational. "Funny how things work out." Claire flinched. It was small, barely perceptible, but he caught it. The restructuring isn't personal, Darius. It's about the survival of the company. If we don't cut costs, we lose everything. Not just your job, everyone's jobs. Is that what you tell yourself? He took a step closer, studying her face. When you sit in this office making decisions about people's lives, do you actually believe you don't have a choice? Her jaw tightened. You don't understand how this works. Then explain it to me, because from where I'm standing it looks pretty simple. Rich people protecting their money at the expense of people who can barely afford rent. It's not that simple. Her voice cracked slightly. Nothing is ever that simple. My daughter is 7 years old. Darius's control slipped just for a moment, letting the raw fear underneath show through. She doesn't know that in a few weeks her father might not be able to pay for her school supplies. She thinks pancakes on Saturday are a guaranteed thing, that the lights will always come on, that daddy's job is safe because he works hard and shows up on time. Are you going to be the one to tell her that none of that matters? Claire turned away, pressing her hands against her desk as if she needed its support. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. You think I don't know what I'm doing? You think I don't lie awake every night thinking about the 240 families who are going to hate me for this? You think I wanted any of this? She spun around, and for the first time since that night in the cafe, he saw the real Claire beneath the corporate armor. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her composure shattered. I am one vote on a board of 12. 12 people who care about nothing except shareholder value and market position. I have spent the last 6 months fighting against this restructuring, proposing alternatives, begging for time, and every single proposal has been shot down. Because the numbers don't care about pancake Saturdays or school supplies or little girls who think their fathers are invincible. The words hung in the air between them, raw and terrible. Darius stared at her, watching the mask crumble piece by piece, revealing the same broken woman who had whispered an apology against his skin. Then why did you tell me? He asked quietly. That night. Why warn me? Because I'm a coward. A tear slid down her cheek, and she didn't bother to wipe it away. Because I wanted someone to know. Because I looked at you. This black man who works himself to exhaustion for a daughter he loves more than anything, and I thought he deserves to know that I'm the monster in this story. I couldn't stop what was coming, but I could at least be honest about who was responsible. Darius felt something shift inside him. The anger was still there, but it was joined now by something else. Something that looked impossibly like understanding. You're not a monster, he said slowly. A monster wouldn't cry about it. Claire let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. That's not how the world works. Monsters cry all the time. They just do terrible things anyway. She moved to the window, looking out at the city spread below them. From up here, the individual lives were invisible, just buildings and streets and the abstract concept of an economy that chewed people up and spat them out without noticing. The board wants me to announce the layoffs on Monday, she said, her voice hollow. I've been given talking points, market positioning, future growth potential, all the words designed to make human suffering sound like a business strategy. Darius joined her at the window, standing close enough to feel the heat radiating from her shoulder. What happens if you don't do it? They'll remove me and find someone who will, someone who won't fight for alternatives or lose sleep over the people getting hurt. Someone who will make the cuts even deeper because they won't care enough to argue. So, you're trapped. We're all trapped. She turned to face him, and for a moment they were back on that bench by the river, two people sharing their darkness. The difference is I'm trapped in a nicer cage. The silence between them was heavy with everything they couldn't change. Darius thought about leaving, about walking out of this office and never looking back, but something kept him rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the memory of her laugh by the river. Maybe it was the way she had touched his chest before whispering her confession. Or maybe it was simply the recognition that anger alone had never fixed anything. Tell me about the alternatives, he said finally. The ones they shot down. Claire blinked, surprised by the question. Why? Because if you've been fighting, then you're not just a vote. You're a person trying to do the right thing in a situation designed to make the right thing impossible. He met her gaze. And I think you deserve to have someone actually listen. She stared at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. Then slowly she walked to her desk and pulled out a thick folder. She held it out to him like an offering. "This is everything," she said, "every proposal, every alternative, every way I've tried to save those jobs without destroying the company." Darius took the folder. It was heavier than he expected. "Walk me through it." They talked for hours. The sun moved across the sky outside Claire's window as she explained the Byzantine world of corporate finance, the pressure from shareholders who cared only about quarterly returns, the board members who saw human beings as line items to be eliminated. She showed him charts and projections, the cold mathematics of capitalism laid bare, but she also showed him her alternatives. A phased reduction plan that would minimize layoffs through attrition and voluntary buyouts. A retraining program that would shift workers to new divisions. A partial automation strategy that would cost more upfront but preserve jobs in the long run. They rejected all of it, Claire said, her voice tight with frustration. Too expensive, too slow, too risky. Darius studied the papers spread across her desk, feeling the weight of her impossible position. He wasn't naive enough to think he understood everything about her world, but he understood enough to see that she had been fighting, really fighting for people like him. "What would happen if you presented these alternatives again?" he asked. "At the board meeting before the announcement. They'd vote them down again, but they'd have to vote in front of everyone, on the record." Claire paused, a flicker of something crossing her face. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that you've been fighting alone, and maybe that's the problem." He leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "What if you weren't alone? What if the people whose jobs are on the line actually showed up and told the board what their decisions mean? Real faces, real stories, real consequences." "That's not how board meetings work, Darius. They don't let maintenance workers address the board." "Then maybe it's time to change how they work." Claire stared at him, and for a moment he saw the woman from the cafe again, the one who had asked him to walk with her because she wasn't ready to go home, the one who had listened to stories about Amara and laughed at his jokes and cried over burdens she couldn't name. "That would be career suicide," she said slowly. "Is your career worth more than 240 families?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving. Claire's face went through a series of expressions: fear, anger, determination, and finally something that looked like resolve. "No," she whispered. "It's not." "Ha!" She reached for her phone, her hands steady despite everything. "I need to make some calls." The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning. Claire spent the intervening days in a whirlwind of activity, making calls, gathering data, building a case that she hoped would be impossible to ignore. Darius returned to his shifts, but something had changed between them. She texted him late at night, updates and questions, and occasionally, just occasionally, something that felt almost like friendship. On Wednesday evening, his phone buzzed with a different kind of message. "I'm scared," it read. "More scared than I've ever been about anything." He typed back without hesitation. "That's how you know it matters." Thursday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of day that made promises hard to believe. Darius had taken the day off, a decision that would have seemed impossible a week ago. He stood outside the Kensington Industries headquarters with a small group of workers, men and women, who had answered Claire's unprecedented invitation to attend the board meeting as observers. They weren't allowed in the boardroom itself, but Claire had arranged for them to wait in an adjacent conference room with a video feed. It was a compromise, a careful negotiation with legal teams who feared lawsuits and executives who feared accountability. But it was something. Darius watched the screen as the board members filed in. 12 men and women in expensive suits who held the fate of hundreds in their manicured hands. Claire entered last, her face pale but composed. She took her seat at the head of the table, a stack of folders in front of her. "Before we proceed with the announced agenda," she began, her voice steady, "I want to present one final alternative to the proposed restructuring." The board chairman, a silver-haired man named Harrison, frowned. Miss Kensington, we've discussed this extensively. The decision has been made. The decision hasn't been voted on yet. I'm requesting a formal vote on the alternative proposal I've prepared with full documentation of each board member's position. A murmur rippled through the room. One of the younger board members leaned forward. This is highly irregular. So is destroying 240 families without at least considering every option. Claire's voice hardened. I've arranged for some of those families to watch this meeting. They're in the next room listening to every word we say. I think they deserve to know who voted for their livelihoods and who voted against. The silence that followed was deafening. Darius watched the board members exchange glances, calculating the political implications. This is coercion, Harrison said coldly. No. Claire stood up, and in that moment she seemed 10 feet tall. This is transparency, something this company has claimed to value while hiding behind closed doors. I'm not asking you to change your minds. I'm asking you to own your decisions. She walked to the door connecting to the conference room and opened it. Darius found himself stepping through, flanked by his co-workers, into the boardroom where the people who controlled their futures sat in leather chairs around a polished table. This is Darius Mitchell, Claire said. He works the night shift at our Columbus facility. He has a 7-year-old daughter named Amara. If the current restructuring goes through, he loses his job in 3 weeks. Darius hadn't prepared anything to say. He hadn't thought he'd be standing here face to face with the people who saw him as nothing more than a number on a spreadsheet. But looking at their uncomfortable faces, he found words he didn't know he had. I'm not here to beg, he said quietly. I know most of you have already made up your minds, but I want you to look at me when you vote. I want you to see me, not a line item, not a cost center, but a person, a father, someone who shows up every night and does his job so this company can function. He paused, letting his gaze move around the table. My daughter thinks I'm a hero. She doesn't know what you're about to do to us. She doesn't understand that some people get to make decisions about other people's lives without ever having to see the consequences. But I see you, and I hope you'll remember that someone was watching when you made your choice. The vote when it came was 8-4 in favor of the original restructuring. Claire's alternative was rejected just as she had predicted, but something had shifted in the room. 4 board members had broken ranks, had voted for the people over the profits, and the 8 who hadn't couldn't quite meet Darius's eyes as they cast their ballots. After the meeting ended, after the workers filed out with their mixture of anger and resignation, Darius found Claire standing alone by the window in her office. She was crying again, but this time the tears seemed different. I'm sorry, she said when he entered. I tried. I really tried. I know you did. He stood beside her, looking out at the city that didn't care about their small drama. And you made them vote on the record. You made them see us. That matters, does it? Because those 240 people are still losing their jobs. But 4 people changed their minds. 4 people who probably never thought twice about workers like me before today. He turned to face her. You didn't win, but you didn't lose alone either. Claire looked at him, and for a moment all the walls between them disappeared. CEO and maintenance worker, rich and poor, the woman who had whispered warnings, and the man who had listened anyway that night by the river, she said quietly. When I told you I was going to destroy your life, I meant it as a goodbye. I thought I'd never see you again. I thought the weight of what I was about to do would be easier to carry if I confessed to a stranger. And now I don't know what to think. She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers cold against his skin. You should hate me. I wouldn't blame you if you did. I probably should. He didn't pull away. But I keep thinking about what you said, about being trapped in a nicer cage, about fighting alone for 6 months, about lying awake thinking of the families who would hate you. He lifted her hand and held it gently. This woman who had everything and nothing, who had cried in a cafe and whispered secrets and stood up to a room full of powerful people because she couldn't live with the alternative. Amara says you should always try to be good even when it's hard. She got it from a cartoon, but she's right. He met Claire's eyes. You tried to be good when it was hard. That's not nothing. That's everything. The weeks that followed were difficult. 236 layoffs proceeded as planned, though Claire managed to negotiate better severance packages and extended benefits. Darius's position was eliminated along with the others, but something unexpected emerged from the wreckage. Claire created a placement program, partnering with other companies to find jobs for displaced workers. It wasn't enough to save everyone, but it was more than anyone had expected. Darius found himself interviewing at a smaller manufacturing firm, one that Claire had personally recommended him to. The job paid better than his old position. The hours were more regular. He was home for dinner with Amara now, able to help her with homework, able to be present in a way that night shifts had never allowed. "Was this your doing?" he asked Claire over coffee one evening at a different cafe from the one where they'd first met. "I made some calls. You did the rest." She smiled, and it was the same warm, unguarded smile she'd shown him that first night. "You're a hard worker with a good reputation. I just made sure the right people knew your name." "Thank you." "Don't thank me. I'm still the person who cost you your job." "You're also the person who stood up in that boardroom." He reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "You're the person who's been calling me every night to make sure Amara and I are okay." Claire's eyes glistened. "We talk about Amara's artwork and her spelling tests and whether you've remembered to eat dinner. It's not exactly heroic." "It's exactly heroic." He squeezed her hand. "Showing up for people, caring about the small things. That's what heroes actually do." They sat there as the evening deepened around them, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely way possible. "Amara wants to meet you," Darius said. "Finally. She keeps asking about the lady from the date. Apparently, my dating profile has been a hot topic of discussion with Mrs. Patterson." Claire laughed, wiping at her eyes. "I'd like that, if you think it's not too soon." "I think she'll love you. She has a thing for strong women who aren't afraid to cry." 2 months later, on a Saturday morning that smelled of maple syrup and possibility, Darius stood at the stove while Amara carefully poured batter onto the griddle. Behind them, Claire sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching father and daughter with an expression of quiet wonder. "You have to wait until the bubbles pop," Amara instructed. "Seriously." "I'll remember that." Claire caught Darius's eye over Amara's head, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of how strange and beautiful life could be. The apartment was small, the furniture was secondhand, and the radiator made ominous clanking sounds every morning, but it was warm, and it was full of laughter. Darius flipped a pancake with practiced ease. Things were different now. Not perfect, not a fairy tale, but different. He had a job that didn't drain his soul. He had a daughter who thought pancake Saturdays were the best thing in the world. And he had Claire, this complicated, wonderful woman who had entered his life as a warning and stayed as something he still didn't have a name for. "Daddy," Amara said, holding up a misshapen pancake with pride. "This one looks like a heart." Darius looked at it, tilting his head. "I think it looks more like a potato." "It's a heart potato," Amara decided for Claire, because she likes potatoes and love. Claire burst out laughing, the sound filling the small kitchen like music. "How did you know I like potatoes?" "Daddy told me." Amara grinned, syrup on her chin. "He says, you're very smart and very pretty, and you like potatoes and crying at sad movies." Hot. Later, while Amara was absorbed in cartoons, Claire and Darius stood together at the window, looking out at the neighborhood that had become home. "I never told you what I whispered that night," Claire said quietly. "The full thing, I mean." "I know. I'm the one who's going to destroy your life." "You said sorry right after, like it was one sentence. I remember." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I meant every word, and I was wrong. Wrong about destroying my life. Wrong about being sorry." She looked up at him, her eyes clear and steady. "I'm not sorry anymore. Not about meeting you. Not about warning you. Not about any of it." Darius put his arm around her, pulling her close. "Neither am I." Amara appeared in the doorway, her face smeared with syrup. "Are you two going to stand there all day?" "Maybe," Darius said. "What's it to you?" "I'm bored. Can Claire teach me how to make fancy coffee like they have in movies?" Claire grinned. "I think we can arrange that." But only if you promise not to touch any buttons without asking. I promise. Amara held out her pinky, and Claire bent down to hook it with her own. Darius watched them together, this unexpected family that had grown from a disastrous blind date and a whispered confession. The morning light slanted through the window, catching the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny promises. Outside, the world kept turning. Inside, a 7-year-old was learning to froth milk while her father looked on, and a CEO who had almost destroyed everything found herself exactly where she needed to be. It wasn't a fairy tale. There was no magic, no dramatic rescue, no happily ever after wrapped in a bow. There was just this, a Saturday morning, a cup of coffee, 3 people who had chosen against all odds to believe that being good was worth the cost. And for now, that was more than